and not because he considered impermanence to be real. Furthermore, before the Buddha appeared in the world, ordinary people used only conventional means to remove the disturbing emotions. But today, when it is a question of uprooting the roots of the disturbing emotions, the Buddha speaks of impermanence. Furthermore, heretical systems speak of deliverance when one is only apparently liberated from the 5 objects of enjoyment, but the Buddha has said, it is on account of wrong concepts that one is bound up, and it is by considering the correct concept of impermanence that one is liberated. Furthermore, there are 2 ways of thinking about the notion of impermanence. I. That which entails a residue. E. That which does not entail a residue. Thus, the Buddha said, when all the beings and all the things have disappeared and only their names remain, impermanence involves a residue. When all the beings and all the things have disappeared and their names have also disappeared, impermanence does not involve a residue. There are also 2 other ways of thinking about impermanence. I. The death of the body and its destruction. E. Births and deaths without continual renewal. Furthermore, some say that morality is the most important. Why? Because in dependence on morality one obtains the cessation of the impurities. Others say that learning is the most important. Why? Because in dependence on wisdom the result is obtained. Others say that meditative stabilization is the most important, for the Buddha said, concentration can attain bodhi. Others say that the 12 strict observances are the most important. Why? Because they purify the practice of morality. This is how each one, maintaining his own practice as the most important, does not seek nirvana diligently. But the Buddha said, these qualities all lead to fractions of nirvana. However, the consideration of the impermanence of dharmas is the true path to nirvana. For all these reasons, and even though dharmas are empty, the Buddha preached the concept of impermanence. Finally, the concept of impermanence is synonymous with the Noble Path. The Buddha designated the path by all kinds of different names. Sometimes he called it the 4 foundations of mindfulness, sometimes he called it the 4 truths, sometimes the notion of impermanence. Anatiyata Sutra. This is what is said in a sutra. If the notion of impermanence is properly cultivated, it destroys all attachment to desire, all attachment to subtle matter, all attachment to the formless, all pride and all ignorance. Thus it eliminates the fetters of the threefold world. This is why it is synonymous with path. This concept of impermanence is sometimes impure and sometimes pure. When it understands impermanence correctly, it is pure. When it begins to study impermanence, it is impure. In the Mahayana, the bodhisattvas with vast mind convert beings in many ways. This is why their notion of impermanence is both impure and pure. If it is pure, it occurs in 9 levels. If it is impure, it occurs in 11 levels. It has as object the 5 aggregates of attachment of the threefold world. It is associated with 4 dominant organs, except that of unpleasantness. For all the reasons given here, worldly people in the saints extol the qualities of the concept of impermanence. E. The concept of suffering. In regard to the concept of suffering, the yogin says to himself that all conditioned dharmas being impermanent or painful. Question. If conditioned dharmas, as impermanent or painful, are the dharmas of holy persons, conditioned but pure, is also painful? Answer. Although dharmas are impermanent, only those who become attached to them experience suffering. Those who are not attached to them are without suffering. Question. There are saints who, without being attached to them, nevertheless undergo suffering. Thus chö-li-fou suffered from sicknesses of wind and heat, pi-ling-kie-po-tso suffered from eye disease, and lo-po-na-po-ti note by kumarajiva. The foremost of the children who bawl a lot, ravanabhadrika, suffered from hemorrhoids. Why do you say that they have no suffering? Answer. There are 2 kinds of suffering. I. Bodily suffering. E. Mental suffering. By the power of their wisdom, the holy individuals have no further mental suffering like sadness, jealousy, malice, etc. On the other hand, Because they have received a body composed of the four great elements as a result of actions in their previous existences. They still have bodily sufferings such as old age and sickness, hunger and thirst, cold and heat, etc. But these bodily sufferings are slight and quite rare. The saint may be compared to a man who, knowing himself to be burdened with a debt with regard to a third party, does not consider it to be painful to discharge the debt. By contrast, the man who does not remember his debt and from whom the creditor demands it forcibly is furious, angry and full of suffering. Question. Painful sensation is a mental event coexisting with the mind. The body, like grass or wood, is disjunct from the mind and without reasoning. How can you say that the holy person feels only bodily suffering? Answer. When the worldly person feels suffering, his mind creates a pang of grief stimulated by the anusaya of hostility. His mind is turned only toward the five objects of enjoyment. As the Buddha said, Saliat-vana Sutra. Worldly people do not know that outside of the five objects of enjoyment, there is another way of getting out of suffering. In pleasant feeling, he is stimulated by the propensity of lust. In unpleasant feeling, he is stimulated by the propensity of hatred. In the feeling that is neither unpleasant nor pleasant, he is stimulated by the propensity of ignorance. When the worldly person feels suffering, inwardly he undergoes the suffering of the threefold poison, namely, desire, hatred and delusion, and outwardly he suffers cold and heat, the whip and the stick, etc. Just as an inwardly feverish man also is burning externally. The same sutra says, when the worldly person loses a loved object, both his body and his mind suffer from it. It is as if he was being pierced by two arrows. The saints, however, do not have the suffering of pangs of grief. They have only the bodily suffering and no other suffering. Furthermore, suffering is associated with the five consciousnesses and the sufferings of the whip and the stick, of cold and heat, etc. Due to external causes, are bodily sufferings. The others are mental sufferings. Furthermore, I have said that pure conditioned dharmas are not suffering because the saints are not attached to them. But the body of the holy individuals is impure. Since impure dharmas are painful, what is the mistake in asserting that the saints feel bodily suffering? But in fact, these sufferings felt by their bodies are faint and rare. Question. If all that is impermanent is suffering, the path too is suffering. How can you drive suffering away with suffering? Answer. The aphorism all that is impermanent is suffering applies to the five aggregates of attachment, but the path, although impermanent insofar as it is formation, is not called suffering. Why? Because it destroys suffering and does not